Verb and Macmillan. However, we left some other questionable practices, e.g., the frequent use of a semicolon where grammatical rules would call for a comma, as they were, primarily because Cambridge did not provide sufficient precedents for changes, even though we would. Editors, preface, Ix. Ourselves have suggested changes to Whitehead had we been editing this book in 1929. Work guidelines. The editors have sought to produce a text that is free not only of the hundreds of blatant original, especially in the Macmillan edition, but also free of many of the minor sorts of inconsistencies recognized and addressed to some extent by the Cambridge editor. It is in the matter of the more significant corrections involving word changes that interpretive bias might lead to textual distortions. There were three factors which helped us guard against this possibility. First, we drew heavily upon a substantial previous work, coordinated by Sherburne, in which the suggested corrigenda lists of 6 scholars were collated and then circulated among 8 scholars for opinions and observations. The publication of the results of these discussions, 7 plus the lengthy discussions that preceded and followed it, have established a consensus view about many items which provided guidance. Second, in their own work the two editors approach Whitehead's thought from different perspectives and focus their work around different sorts of interest. Third, we use the principle that no changes would be introduced into the text unless they were endorsed by both editors. We note, finally, that there can be no purely mechanical guidelines to guarantee objectivity and prevent distortion. Ultimately, editors must rely upon their own judgment, their knowledge of their texts, and their common sense. Recognizing this, we accept full responsibility for decisions we have made. Besides the issues discussed above, there were other editorial decisions to be made. There were substantial differences of format between the two original editions. Cambridge had a detailed table of contents at the beginning of the book, whereas Macmillan had only a brief listing of major divisions at the beginning with the detail spread throughout the book as abstracts, prior to each of the 5 major parts of the volume. Primarily the various sections of this analytic table of contents in Macmillan, we have followed Cambridge in this matter. We have also followed the Cambridge edition in setting off some quotations and have let it guide us in regard to the question as to which quotations to set off the Macmillan edition's page-length items. Since most of the secondary literature on process and reality gives page references to the Macmillan edition, we considered very seriously of retaining its pagination in this new edition. For several technical, 7 Donald W. Sherburne, Corrigenda for Process and Reality, in Klein, ed. Op. Cit. pp. to 207. X. Editor's Preface. Reasons this proved impractical. Consequently, we have inserted in this text, in brackets, the page numbers of the Macmillan edition, except in the table of contents. In regard to certain minor differences between the texts, some of which reflect American versus British conventions, we have followed Macmillan. Examples are putting periods and commas inside the quotation marks, numbering the footnotes consecutively within each chapter rather than on each page, and writing instead of tilde. Except for those matters, which simply reflect different conventions, we have left a record of all of the changes which we have made. That is, in the notes at the back of the book we have indicated all the divergencies or, in a few cases, types of divergencies from both original editions, no matter how trivial, thereby giving interested scholars access to both previous readings through this corrected edition. We have indicated in the text, by means of single and double apophthegms, the places where these divergencies occur. The more exact meaning of these symbols, plus that of the single and double asterisks, is explained in the introductory statement to the editor's notes. The original editions had woefully inadequate indexes. For this volume, Griffin has prepared a totally new, enormously expanded index. Sincere thanks are due to Professor Marjorie Sakaki, who correlated the index items to the pagination in this edition, and to Professor Bernard M. Woomer, who many years ago prepared an expanded index which was made available to other scholars. One process in reality has appeared which has not yet been mentioned. In 1969, the Free Press published a paperback edition. It should in no way be confused with the present by the same company. The 1969 edition did not incorporate the core agenda which had been published by Sherburne. It added some new errors of its own. It introduced yet another pagination without indicating the previous standard pagination, and it did not contain a new index. We wish to commend the Free Press for now publishing this corrected edition. We acknowledge most gratefully the support of the Vanderbilt Muni Research which provided Sherburne with travel funds and released time to work on this project. We are also deeply indebted to the Center for Process Studies, which has supported this project extensively in turn to both the Claremont Graduate School and the School of Theology at Claremont, which gives support to the center. Finally, we express our warm appreciation to Rebecca Parker Bayer, who was a great help in comparing texts and reading proofs. David Ray Griffin Center for Process Studies, Donald W. Sherburne, Vanderbilt University. These lectures are based upon a recurrence to that phase of philosophic thought which began with Descartes and ended with Hume. Philosophic scheme which they endeavor to explain is termed the philosophy of organism. There is no doctrine put forward which cannot cite in its defense some explicits of this group of thinkers, or of one of the two founders of all Western thought, Plato and Aristotle. But the philosophy of organism is apt to emphasize just in the elements in the writings of these masters which subsequent systematizers have put aside. The writer who most fully anticipated the main positions of the philosophy of organism is John Locke in his essay, especially one in its later books. The lectures are divided into 5 parts. In the first part, the method is explained, and terms of which the cosmology is to be framed, is stated summarily. In the second part, Tian endeavors this scheme is adequate for the interpretation of the ideas and problems which form the complex texture of civilized thought. Apart from such an investigation, the summary statement of Part 1 is practically unintelligible. Thus Part 2 at once gives meaning to the verbal phrases of the scheme by their use in discussion, and shows the power of the scheme of our experience into a consistent relation to each other. In order to obtain a reasonably complete account of human experience considered in relation to the philosophical problems which naturally arise, the group of philosophers and scientists belonging to the 17th and 18th centuries has been considered, in particular Descartes, Newton, Locke, Hume, Kant. Any one of these writers is one-sided in his presentation of the groundwork of experience, a whole presentation which dominates the development of subsequent philosophy. I started the investigation with the expectation of being occupied with the exposition of the divergencies from every member of this group. But a careful examination of their exact statements disclosed that in the main the philosophy of organism is a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought. These philosophers were perplexed by the inconsistent presuppositions underlying their inherited modes of expression. There. 1 cf. An essay concerning human understanding. IV, ch. V. Sec. 11. Sheath. Preface. Sheath. Successors have endeavored to be rigidly systematic. The tendency has been to abandon just those elements in their thought upon which the philosophy of organism bases itself. An endeavor has been made to point out the exact points of agreement and of disagreement. In the second part, the discussion and modern thought have been confined to the most general notions of physics and biology, with a careful avoidance of all detail. Also, it must be one of the motives of a complete cosmology to construct a system of ideas which brings the aesthetic, and moral, and religious interests into relation with those concepts of the world which have their origin in natural science. In the third and fourth parts, the cosmological scheme is developed in terms of its own cadence, and without other systems of thought. For example, in Part 2 there is a chapter on the extensive continuum, which is largely concerned with the notions of Descartes and Newton, CQM paired with the way in which the organic philosophy must interpret this feature of the world. But in Part 4, this question is treated from the point of view of developing the detailed method RV, in which the philosophy of organism establishes the theory. It must be thoroughly understood that the theme of these lectures is not a detached consideration of various traditional philosophical problems which acquire urgency in certain traditional systems of thought. The lectures are intended to state a condensed scheme of cosmological ideas, to develop their meaning by confrontation with the various topics of experience, and finally to elaborate an adequate cosmology in terms of which all particular topics find their interconnections. Thus the unity of treatment is to be looked for in the gradual development of the scheme, in meaning and in relevance, and not in the successive treatment of particular topics. For example, the doctrines of time, of space, of perception, and of causality are recurred to again and again, as the cosmology develops. In each recurrence, these topics throw some new light on the scheme, or receive some new elucidation. At the end, insofar as the enterprise has been successful, there should be no problem of space-time, or of epistemology, or of causality, left over for discussion. should have developed all those generic notions adequate for the expression of any possible interconnection of things. Among the contemporary schools of thought, my obligations to the English and American realists are obvious. In this connection, I should like especially to mention Professor T.P. Nunn, of the University of London. His anticipations, in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, of symbolism and realism, do not appear to be sufficiently well known. I am also greatly indebted to Bergson, William James, and John Dewey. One of my preoccupations has been to rescue their type of thought from the charge of anti-intellectualism, which rightly has been associated with it. Finally, though throughout the main body of the work I preface, am in sharp disagreement with Bradley, the final outcome is after all not so greatly different. I am particularly indebted to his chapter on the nature of experience, which appears in his essays on truth and reality. His insistence on feeling is very consonant with my own conclusions. This whole metaphysical position is an implicit repudiation of the doctrine of vacuous actuality. The fifth part is concerned with the final interpretation of the ultimate way in which the cosmological problem is to be conceived. It answers the question, what does it all come to? The approximation to Bradley is evident. Indeed, if this cosmology be deemed successful, it becomes natural at this point to ask whether the type of thought involved be not a transformation of some main doctrines of absolute idealism onto a realistic basis. These lectures will be best understood by noting the following list of prevalent habits of thought, which are repudiated as concerns their influence on philosophy. The distrust of speculative philosophy. The trust in language as an adequate expression of propositions. The mode of philosophical thought which implies, and is implied by, the faculty psychology. Subject-predicate form of expression. The sensationalist doctrine of perception. The doctrine of vacuous actuality. The Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct from purely subjective experience. The arbitrary deductions in ex absurdo arguments. Its belief that logical inconsistencies can indicate anything else than some antecedent errors. By ready acceptance of some, or all, of these 9 myths and fallacious procedures, much 19th century philosophy excludes itself from relevance to the ordinary stubborn facts of daily life. The positive doctrine of these lectures is concerned with the becoming, the being, and the relatedness of actual entities. Actual entity is a res vera in the Cartesian sense of that term. To it as a Cartesian substance, and not an Aristotelian primary substance. Descartes retained in his metaphysical doctrine the Aristotelian dominance of the category of quality over that of relatedness. In these lectures, relatedness is dominant over quality. All relatedness has its foundation in the relatedness of actualities, and such relatedness is wholly concerned with the appropriation of the dead by the living, that is to say, with objective immortality, whereby what is divested of its own living immediacy becomes. I derive my comprehension of this element in Descartes thought from Professor Gilson of the Sorbonne. I believe that he is the first to insist on its I am. Importance. He is Of course, not responsible for the use made of the notion in these lectures. 14. Preface. A real component in other living immediacies of becoming. This is the doctrine that the creative advance of the world is the becoming, the objective immortalities of those things which jointly constitute stubborn fact. The history of philosophy discloses two cosmologies which at different periods have dominated European thought: Plato's Timaeus, and the cosmology of the 17th century, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Locke. In attempting an enterprise of the same kind, it is wise to follow the clue that perhaps the true solution consists in a fusion of the two previous schemes, with modifications demanded by self-consistency and the advance of knowledge. The cosmology explained in these lectures has been framed in accordance with this reliance on the positive value of the philosophical tradition. One test of success is adequacy in the comprehension of the variety of experience within the limits of one scheme of ideas. The endeavor to satisfy this condition is illustrated by comparing chapters 3, 7, and X of respectively entitled, The Order of Nature, the Subjectivist Principle, and Process, with chapter XB of Part 3, entitled, The Higher Phases of Experience, and with chapter 5 of Part 4, entitled, Measurement, and with chapter 2 of Part 5, entitled, God and That World. These chapters should be recognizable as the legitimate outcome of the one scheme of ideas stated in the second chapter of Part 1. In these lectures I have endeavored to compress the material derived from years of meditation. In putting out these results, 4 strong impressions dominate my mind. First, that the movement of historical and philosophical criticism of detached questions, which on the whole has dominated the last 2 centuries, has done its work, and requires to be supplemented by a more sustained effort of constructive thought. Secondly, that the true method of philosophical construction is to frame a scheme of ideas, the best that one can, and unflinchingly to explore the interpretation of experience in terms of that scheme. Thirdly, that all constructive thought, on the various special topics of scientific interest, is dominated by some such scheme, unacknowledged, but no less influential in guiding the imagination. The importance of philosophy lies in its effort to make such schemes explicit, and thereby capable of criticism and improvement. There remains the final reflection: how shallow, puny, and imperfect are efforts to sound the things. In philosophical discussion, the merest hint of dogmatic certainty as to finality of statement is an exhibition of folly. In the expansion of these lectures to the dimensions of the present book, 3. I regret that Professor A.E. Taylor's commentary on Plato's Timaeus was only published after this work was prepared for the press. Thus, with the exception of one small reference, no use could be made of it. I am very greatly indebted to Professor T's Preface. I, 15. Have been greatly indebted to the critical difficulties suggested by the membered my Harvard classes. Also, this work would never have been written without the constant encouragement and counsel which Lotha, my wife, A.N.W. Harvard University, January, 1929. Contents. Editor's Preface. Part 1: The Speculative Scheme. Chapter I. Speculative philosophy. Speculative philosophy. Coherent, logical, necessary system of ideas, interpretation of experience. 2. Defects of insight and of language, conditions for observation, rigid empiricism, imagination, generalization, coherence and incoherence, the ultimate. 3. Rationalism and dogmatism. Scheme is a matrix, false and true propositions, use of the matrix, experimental advent. 2. IV. Philosophy and science, grades of generality, dogmatic influence of mathematics, progress of philosophy. D. Defects of language, proposition ground, their background, metaphysical presupposition, excessive trust in language, metaphysics in practice, metaphysics in linguistic expression. D. Speculative ambition, overambition, dogmatism and progress, interpretation and metaphysics, the higher elements of experience, subjectivity and the metaphysical correction, morality, religions, connected by philosophy, contrast between religion and science, conclusion. Chapter 2. The Kate-Glorial Scheme. 4. Namely, actual entity, prehension, nexus, the ontological principle, Descartes and Locke, philosophy explanatory of abstraction, not of concreteness. 2. The 4 sets of categories, the category of the ultimate. VXL. 3. 18. XVI. Contents. Conjunction and disjunction, creativity, the principle of novelty, creative advance, togetherness, increscence, 8 categories of existence, 27 categories of explanation. 3. 9 categorial obligations. IV. Preliminary notes. Complete abstraction self-contradictory. Principles of unrelativity of actual entities never change. Perishing of occasions and their objective immortality. Fundamental causation and efficient causation. Multiplicities. Substance. Chapter 3. Some derivative notions. Primordial nature of God, relevance, the divine ordering, consequent nature of God, its acquirement of character, creatures, objective immortality, novelty, relevance, appetition and mentality, conceptual prehensions, pure and I am pure prehensions, synonyms and analogies, namely, conceptual prehension, appetition, intuition, physical purpose, vision, envisagement. 2. Social order, heuristic, substantial form, personal order, serial inheritance, enduring object, corpus. Who are societies? 3. Classic notion of time, unique seriality, continuity, Zeno, atomism and continuity, corpuscular and wave theories of light. IV. Consciousness, thought, sense perception or elements in an instance of experience. Part 2 Discussions and Applications. Chapter I. Fact and form. Appeal to facts, European tradition, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant, intrinsic reasonableness, footnotes to Plato, this cosmonic anticipating forms, divine ordering, ontological principle, Facts the only reasons. Facts are process, prehension, satisfaction. 2. Rationalism of faith. Adventure of hope. Limits of theory. Gibbonus, T. Professor A.